an industrial development research program at the University of Scotland. He's worked on government and boards of public entities. His PhD in economics is from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His research areas are international finance, financialization, global corporate structure, industrial policy, and economic development. His career has bridged academia and government, where he's endeavored to improve economic policy, and he's contributed towards rethinking how economic support in South Africa to try and take account of heterodox economic perspectives.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the organizers for including me very much, and to say that I've really enjoyed this workshop and all the inputs. And I suppose as a macroeconomist, I feel slightly as an intruder in this space, but and also as somebody who talks about elites without actually defining it. Elites are basically the rich people who run the large corporations that control everything, without really saying how they control everything. But a lot of what we do as economists empirically is look at the outcomes and make show the relationship between the outcomes and the structures. And the form of the work I was looking at social structures of accumulation in South Africa. So I'm going to focus on three ways in which the elites have shaped post-apartheid South Africa policy and outcomes. The first is to very briefly touch on issues that from a paper that Firoz Khan and I published in the International Review of Applied Economics, looking at the role of the elites during the transition from apartheid. The second one then is to look at the continued domination of all key markets in this highly concentrated economy with obscene inequality. And just to say that obscene inequality is actually a classification of South Africa using the Palmer ratio. If you have a Palmer ratio of 3, like Brazil, you have extreme inequality. And if you have a Palmer ratio of 4 and above, you have obscene inequality. And South Africa's is well over 7. I also make this point because in my job, which I should say I'm not representing the views of the South African Parliamentary Budget Office or Parliament here. So please, if there are any people from the media, don't quote me, particularly as the Minister of Finance is starting his speech now, I think. His budget speech. So don't take this. This is just my views. But yeah, I think in my job, I often have to come back and tell people about the high levels of inequality in South Africa. And it's not just something that we keep saying, oh, South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. It actually means something very real for us and our people's lives and our development and lack of development. So the first point, I think, is that to understand that the elites weren't just stakeholders at the time of the transition from apartheid. It's often presented as this was a negotiation between the political parties and the National Party and the ANC, but that the representatives of the largest conglomerates and corporations, finance and non-financial corporations, played a lead role in shaping the outcomes. And in fact, they had this role before the end of apartheid, from the time of P.W. Botha's regime, when it included big business in the state security structures against the total danger, the swart gevaar and the rooi gevaar, and it was part of the total strategy. And the role given to big business at that time, and the representatives of big businesses who were part of those structures, was actually to then say how the apartheid government should be promoting free market policies. When Botha was ousted and de Klerk took over, those kind of centralized structures were closed down, but he maintained that, and he brought senior people from business and the financial sector into key economic roles as ministers and also other senior roles. And so people like Derek Keynes played a huge part in the discussions with the ANC and others during the transition to convince them. And in fact, a lot of the ANC's policies, particularly when they rejected the macroeconomic research group's suggestions, had come from the normative economic model. There's a huge continuity in the kind of macroeconomic and other policies, neoliberal policies, from the apartheid era, the late apartheid era, through the current period. And all the ministers for the economic post in Mandela's government of national unity, the first one, were basically either from the National Party, like Pukwatia or Kraipa Nekia, Pukwatia Minister of Minerals and Energy, Kraipa Nekia Minister of Agriculture, or people like Derek Keys and others who were Minister of Finance or Minister of Trade and Industry, etc. And then there was a process of sort of acclimating people to a black majority government and getting black people into those roles, and including again, and people like Harry Oppenheimer, Anton Rupert actually played a lobbying role in ensuring that these people became senior people within the government of national unity. So that was there. Once the ANC, though, and the leadership of the Department of Economic Planning, the ANC, that became senior government officials, ministers, etc., particularly within National Treasury, had become neoliberal and internalized neoliberal economic thinking and macroeconomic thinking, I think it became less necessary for big business to be so involved in policy formation. They still play a huge role in lobbying, but we also now subject to credit ratings agencies, bond markets, and other things in sort of asserting this view of what credible economic policies are, what macroeconomic policies are. And this sort of brings me to the third one, is that within that process, if you look at, for instance, the formation of GTAC within the National Treasury as a think tank for government that then tells other departments how they should be doing their planning, the distribution of budget, forming their budget, and also then thinking through how the budget gets formed. This thinking about, that the deficit is too high. Sorry, did you want me? Okay, so is very clearly shaped through the hegemony and dominance of neoclassical macroeconomics, which is the main form of macroeconomics taught in all the universities. It's what the experts, the people who are advising government, the Economic Advisory Council, the people who work in this economics department, including in SCIS, I must say, unfortunately. That's the kind of macroeconomic framework that then gets shaped. And within that, there are huge, crazy assumptions that aren't questioned that actually support the neoliberal macroeconomic policy thinking. There's a separation between the real and the financial markets, the classical dichotomy. There's a thinking that government investment, or what I would call investment in welfare, improving resilience of households within this public crisis we live in, I see that as an investment that's treated purely as a consumption expenditure. And what is seen as investment is government putting money into infrastructure or easing the conditions for big business. And so I hopefully I'll have time to come back to this and how this this belief in neoclassical macroeconomics and its hegemony is actually, unfortunately, I think, exacerbated the crisis of unemployment, poverty, and inequality, and end up with the kind of budget we're going to get today, which is an austerity budget. I'm sorry if I went over.
So next up, we have Uchicha Pania, and Uchicha is a senior researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. She works with the Wealth Inequality and Elites research stream at SCIS. Her research interests include economic elites, caste, race, and gender in India and South Africa. Her research in India unpacks how business caste from other worlds reproduces in Delhi with a focus on the gender question. In South Africa, she has researched property elites, landowners, and property developers involved in the making of Waterfall City. Over to you.
Thank you, Katie. It's an honor to be in conversation with all of you in front of colleagues and friends. And it's been such a generative discussion that we've had. And this public panel comes at the back of that generative discussion. I'm a sociologist, and as Katie mentioned, my interest is in studying economic elites in India and South Africa using a lens of caste, race, and gender. So I want to share 3 things about elites. I'm a qualitative researcher, which means I get face time with elites with great difficulty. So, I can actually tell you how these people think about themselves. So let me start by saying that elites like to think of themselves as moral actors, right? They like to think of themselves as people who would be liked. And you might say, why does that even matter? It matters because that is the way in which they devise strategies for legitimization in societies. Right? So, currently in South Africa, what we see in terms of a white panic or a white victimhood, which has gone global, or in India, what we hear as Brahmin victimhood, I would locate these traits within this larger universe of wanting to be seen as moral actors. Of course, in brackets, then is this understanding that they're also ahistorical, right? Of course, that's a given here. So in my research, drawing on a decade-long research, as Katie mentioned, amongst the Agarwals in Delhi, my most recent publication shows how these people see themselves as religious, patriotic, and self-sacrificial individuals. And, it's not that they just woke up and started thinking like this. They did careful work around it. So they spent 5 decades through their caste associations publicizing accounts of their patriarch, the patriarch from whom they trace their lineage in the caste community. And they constructed him as an extremely moral character. And they updated the myth according to the needs that they had politically and the kind of political claims they wanted to make. So the first strategy was to standardize and publicize the myth of the patriarch. The second strategy then was to take his name and use that to name public spaces in Delhi, right? To knit the patriarch in a national imagination. The patriarch is not just an upper caste individual here, he's a figure of the nation. The third strategy that they did is that they realized that if they keep opening schools and colleges in Delhi named after one merchant or the other, people are not going to learn that it's the collective strength of the community. So when I say elites think of themselves as moral actors, in the Indian case, it's not an individual strategy. It is a collective upper caste identitarian strategy that one is interested in unpacking. So, and it's a strategy of elite power, right? So finally, when they've named, a lot of public spaces after their patriarch, they've got national holidays, you have chief ministers congratulating them for having a patriarch like this in the community. That's when they take this forward in terms of philanthropy by naming trusts in societies after the patriarch. And in that way, they can strengthen their claim that they're working for the common good of the society. So their claim to political power then is a moral claim. It's not a direct claim of saying that I have the money, so I should rule. It's a claim which is rooted in symbolic politics as well, which is to say that we deserve to rule because not only are we wealthy, but we are also moral, right? So that's the first thing about elites that I'll put on the table. The second thing is what to bear in mind is that I think a lot of papers yesterday also showed us how elites like the echo chambers, right? And these echo chambers could be of caste, as is the case in the first one that we saw. And however, because we are in South Africa and the persistence of the spatial, racial geographies, I want to say that these echo chambers in South Africa are spatial, right? And they're actively produced. So these echo chambers are produced by elites, by molding urban space for a generation of Black elites and Black middle class. And you see, this draws on my research, which is still in work in progress, and which looks at the city on the urban periphery called Waterfall, where I look at the relationship between the landowners and the property developers to show the ways in which the city is made, right? And in the process of making that city, through careful institutionalized and legal arrangements, through their professional class of lawyers, engineers, environmental specialists, asset managers, and bank officials, what ends up happening is that this liberation mandate of dismantling apartheid spatial legacies stays incomplete and continues to perpetuate, right? Urban spatial inequality, of course, has also been understood in terms of an urban sprawl, which is a spatial mismatch between where workers stay and where they go to work, right? So a city like that further strengthens that. And a city like this can be built by controlling who's the neighbor. And in this case, coincidentally, it's the University of Witwatersrand, which was tied in a court case with them for 10 years. Not only do they work around land and more space like that, but they also work around the river, which flows through the city, which is then, cleaned out, pumped through ozone plants and transformed into a turquoise blue lagoon in which the middle class can swim. And what a historical irony to do this, right? To pull this off. So finally, the first 2 points that I put on the table then is that, that elites are moral actors, right? That's the first thing. The second is that elites like to function and they actively mold echo chambers through legal and public institutional arrangements and their class of professionals. And finally, the third point that I want to make is about the kind of relationship between economic elites and political elites that Siraj has picked up on. This relationship, as we see in South Africa, is a historical one. It's an extremely important one to try and understand the nature and type of elite power and political governance one will end up with. In India, in the last 10 years, we have seen an increased proximity between business and political elites, right? It's like a family affair. The Prime Minister calls it a family affair, so it's not just me, right? So in that case of extreme proximity between business and political elites, and the first 2 points that I've already tabled, what you end up with, and there are many switches, okay, I think I've missed about 10 points here, but I want to conclude by saying you get the kind of governance in India that we have currently, which is of the Hindu fascist government, where the climate crisis is further tipping and aggressively tipping because of the kinds of ways in which they see the world and the ways in which the space and land and water should be molded. Thank you.
Okay, next we have Katya Nico, who's head of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development Fund Office and leads the Transformative Social Policy Programme. She is lead author and coordinator of the 2022 flagship report, Crises of Inequality, Shifting Power for a New Eco-Social Contract, and the 2016 UNRWA flagship report, Policy Innovations for Transformative Change, Implementing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In partnership with the Green Economy Coalition, she represents UNRWA as co-convener of the Global Research and Action Network for a New Eco-Social Contract.
Thank you, Katie, and also many thanks to the Southern Center of Inequality Studies. It's a pleasure to be here again. We have worked over the last couple of years occasionally together on this exciting topic of how to understand, and then how to reduce inequalities. And also thank you very much to Katie for having us participating in her really exciting research project and this very stimulating and inspiring workshop that we had over the last 2 days. So what I would like to tell you in my 5 minutes is a little bit how, where do the United Nations come into this debate? So is actually elite power a topic, in international development cooperation? I'm also speaking as a macroeconomist and development economist. And what I can tell you is that it was, the first big achievement, I would say, over the last couple of years was actually to put inequalities on the table, because the international development community is very much concerned, of course, with catching up and how to create growth and jobs and so on and so forth, but then to how to reduce poverty. So the big focus was always on the poor, and basically the poor were seen as the problem that we have to fix. And there was actually no attention to what happens at the top of the income distribution. So elites were really not part of the narrative. Elites were actually probably seen, as enlightened leaders, or, as those that, actually contributing to the economy and to the leadership in the country. They were not, seen as a problematic group of actors. As I said, fortunately, inequality is now a big concern within the UN, and we can see it as it was integrated as SDG 10, as the Sustainable Development Goal number 10. Very controversial debate, but nevertheless, it was agreed that all member states committed to reduce inequalities within and between countries. But again, if you look at the indicators and how inequalities are measured, you see it It is largely a shared prosperity index. The Palmer index was never really officially integrated into the measurements. And again, there was no attention to the top of the income distribution. We are very aware of this fact, and as UNREST, United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, we tend to try to push certain topics onto the agenda, and kind of do away with some blind spots that we see in the UN. So we started to organize a big research inquiry about how to address inequalities and how to address elite power, and also what can be done about it. How can we create coalitions and social society movements, and how can we change policies and institutions, and also global governance to address these issues? And when we really started with this inquiry, we noted, that of course this global development community, if I can call it that way, is not really aware of the role, or just maybe aware, but really not putting on the table or not debating or discussing the role of elites. So it is a big black box, basically. We don't know, what the perceptions of elites are, how they acquired their wealth and income, what are their views vis-a-vis redistributional policies, how different factors, come together so they can preserve their privileges. All of this is not really a discussion. So we really tried, to change this. And I would say, one is always operating, of course, in a certain zeitgeist, that we are not the only actors. So at the same time, we had the work of Piketty and the Paris School. We had the work of Oxfam, that really pointed out how we have this extreme income concentration at the top, how we have a creation of billionaires by the day, how the COVID pandemic, and we would say that the entire economic paradigm that is dominant over the last 3 decades, neoliberal hyperglobalization, how we call it, has led to very extreme inequality in terms of wealth and income, and of course intersecting also with inequalities that have existed before, related to race and gender and other social markers. So it is now acknowledged, basically, that inequality is very bad for the SDGs and very bad for sustainable development, because it creates economic crises, it makes poverty reduction difficult, and it is also bad for the environment. However, the role of elites, again, was not very clear in this picture. So what we tried to, to bring into the debates was really to say, especially wealthy elites, not necessarily politicians or intellectuals or bureaucrats, but especially, powerful corporations and wealthy elites, tend to try to protect the status quo, tend to create obstacles for redistributive policies. And they have a lot of power resources to do so. And my colleague Maggie will speak more about that. But it was really important that we brought these issues onto the table, and this very interesting research that sociologists and others are doing, but that were never part of these mainstream development discussions. Because as another participant today in the workshop said, if we don't understand basically what motivates elites, how they strategize, how they interfere in the political process, and how they exercise their power, we also cannot identify entry points, on how maybe to better negotiate with them, or how to build, counter pressure or counter alliances that are able really to promote inequality reducing policies. Thank you.
Okay, so next we have Maggie Carter, who is a senior research analyst at UNREST in the Transformative Social Policy Programme. She's also co-author and coordinator of the UNRWA's 2022 flagship report, Crisis and Inequality, which is a sweeping study of inequality in times of crisis and a call to redesign our global systems. In addition, she co-edited the volume Between Fault Lines and Front Lines, Shifting Power in an Unequal World, which explores how elites and institutions of power deepen social and economic cleavages across the globe, and looks to examples of counterpower pushing back against them. Her research applies feminist, decolonial, and intersectional approaches to explore how to rein in elite power, create inclusive and rights-based systems that are resilient to crisis, and implement alternative development approaches that center environmental, economic, and social justice. Over to you.
Thanks, Katie and Ujika for inviting us. As Katya said, we both feel very privileged to be here and hope that our kind of global UN perspective can add something to these very rich empirical discussions that my fellow panelists bring. So yeah, as Katya mentioned, I wanted to speak just a bit about the extreme influence that elites have over political processes. It's a vast topic, but I'll talk about a few examples that I think are interesting and relevant to the discussions we've been having. We know, of course, that that elites have this highly outsized influence over political systems. Elites, there's a proven what's called an affluence bias in policymaking, where we see that the interests of elites are overwhelmingly represented in policies across the board, and that trend is increasing. They are overwhelmingly more satisfied with the results of political systems. They participate more, and they have greater. They're more represented in politics. And elites wield this power, of course, through a number of different mechanisms, by offering or withholding resources to states, which pressures governments to accommodate their demands, by lobbying politicians, by funding campaigns, by purchasing control of media. Even philanthropy is a way in which elites can influence national interests. So to turn to a few aspects that I think are interesting for this discussion, moments of crisis and social upheaval and transition, while we, I think, would like to hope that they often open up spaces for the disenfranchised to gain ground, in fact, we see often present opportunities for elites to leverage their power and perpetuate their political interests at an even greater scale than in moments of well, at this point, it's all moments of crisis, I'd say. In these moments, corporations time and again manage to wield their influence to direct the state to implement policies that minimize risks for them. A very obvious example is the 2008 financial crisis, when it was really the threat of systemic collapse that gave the financial sector just blanket power and enormous leverage over governments and their actions to address the crisis. While responses centered on bailing out banks and creditors, rather than minimizing impacts on vulnerable groups in terms of job loss, foreclosures, and austerity policy. During the COVID pandemic, corporations had an extremely outsized role in determining policy responses to the crisis. A number of companies successfully lobbied to maintain operations at the expense of great risk to their employees. Many managed to secure immunity from COVID-related lawsuits. Others managed to negotiate putting on hold the passage of very important environmental legislation and successfully lobbied for tax cuts and stimulus money. And the result was, of course, widespread protection of corporate revenues over safety of workers. And one statistic that I think is quite striking from this period that illustrates the way that this plays out is that during the pandemic, the number of ultra high net worth individuals increased by 50%, while 120 million people were sent into extreme poverty. And one of the great injustices of the last years that happened during this pandemic, large pharmaceutical corporations backed by powerful governments and supported by major philanthropies lobbied to maintain intellectual property protections of COVID vaccines, which of course led to immeasurable human costs. Another point that I want to make is the way that the political influence of elites plays out in local contexts and how this creates a compounding cycle of entrenched political inequality by closing out spaces of participation. So if we look at the way cities restructure their urban policies to become more appealing to wealthy residents and to investors, we see a progression of increasing political inequality in those spaces. And then this growing political inequality makes these trends nearly impossible to reverse. When cities court wealth in order to, of course, boost property values, attract business headquarters, and the results of these policies facilitate flow of capital into certain sectors, into luxury real estate, upscale commercial developments, and away from accessible public space, affordable housing, egalitarian infrastructure, and functioning public services. And we see the urban landscape being reshaped around high net worth individuals, which of course comes at the expense of lower income residents. Meanwhile, the power of elites that they have to make the choice to relocate or withhold investments and the impact that that would mean on cities creates a stronger and stronger grip on local decision making. But beyond this sort of more passive influence, they also actively work to influence local government through lobbying, sponsoring campaigns, all of the kinds of processes that I mentioned before, but on a local level. And oftentimes engaging and taking over more progressive local processes, things like participatory budgeting. There's quite a lot of research across the globe that shows that this is happening in many cases where elites are co-opting these processes that are meant to be more participatory, ultimately undermining democracy and the voice of citizens. And the sort of final point around this is that, related to this, is that as these kind of processes happen, we see public spaces being raised and privatized, creating more isolated communities, retreat into private spaces, and a shift away from a sense of public good and a breakdown of our social contract and social cohesion, which then closes off spaces for public participation, and ultimately means greater socioeconomic gaps, spatial segregation, and political alienation as trust in our governments erodes and powerlessness begins to pervade. So I'll stop there and can continue to discuss in future minutes.
Great,
Thank you.
Okay, so last but not least, we have Ms. Vanna Maloti, who is an Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity and a South African political economist. Her research, analysis, and projects focus on forging social justice through feminist economics, collective action, and intersectional feminist principles of care and accountability. Currently, Ms. Vanna works as the senior campaigns manager for campaign organizing at Wikimedia Foundation, a non-profit organization that provides the essential infrastructure for free knowledge. In this role, she supports a diverse community from across the world to contribute to the free knowledge movement. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Katie, and good to be here with everyone. I'm going to put my own timer on. So I'm also an economist, but I like to call myself a recovering economist, and I tell that joke on every single panel I've been on. And I think it's partly because of some of the dire effects we see of economic policy on just everyday decision making, including cost benefit analysis and rationality as the key defining metrics for how decisions might be made. And I appreciate all of the contributions of my co-panelists here, because it really is an important conversation to be a part of, to distill, I think, in particular, how elites and elites thinking and elite power is not solely about politics and economics, but also about culture and the influence of culture and hegemony on decision-making in the policy landscape. And this is the fundamental way in which I'm defining elites, actually based on a previous conversation that we had. I think it was it Seeger who said that she defines elites by power and not by, yeah, thank you for that, not by necessarily political or economic elites. And in this conversation, it's important to know that we're talking about power from the civil society perspective, because I think that we see a lot of differences between how civil society actors consolidate power and how they interact with political and economic elites and other structures. And I want to start by the context of South Africa and looking at what happened in the transition with our civil society movements. Some will know that during the transition, as the state is forming its priorities, and there's almost a search for capable individuals with influence, that the UDM and trade union leaders and others who had been effective and influential in rallying sort of the public education and knowledge of how power and exclusion works are absorbed into the post-apartheid government, which creates almost a vacuum in this third space of organizing, of learning, of education. And I honestly hypothesize that because there's this vacuum that requires access to power and resources, that the people who fill these vacuums are liberal white men. And so you see civil society almost transition from really being embedded in the local structures into a very nuanced and different way of organizing in society. What happens then in this rise of sort of the liberal white leader of civil society organizations is that there are opportunities and challenges that emerge. First of all, some of the opportunities include that you can engage with the state on its commitment to redress through constitutionalism. And anyone who studied the work of some really important trans activists working in South Africa and in the context of Fees Must Fall know that while constitutionalism is fundamentally an important process for addressing inequality, it is insufficient because it does not connect to the reality of the people. And so in order to exercise constitutionalism and legal knowledge, you have to be an elite, right? You can't appear before the High Court without any form of legal training or background. The next opportunity that emerges for this cohort of civil society leaders is their access to other elites, particularly in philanthropic spaces. And so you see this transnational distribution of power where Ford and other well-known funders come into the South African context, and there's almost a cultural hegemony of what it looks like to be professionalized as a civil society organization addressing inequality in a country like South Africa. The result of this is that oftentimes the civil society spectrum oscillates between a very social justice service model, which is we provide education, we provide lobbying for access to water and toilets and sanitation, in a sometimes predominantly non-racial way. It doesn't situate the demand for those concerns within a historical context of inequality. And the other side of that is you see sort of this rise of think tanks and technical experts. And I wasn't going to name names, but I'm so glad you said GTAC. There are others, but I won't mention them. So this professionalized body of civil society actors who use big data to give recommendations and guidance to the state. And the third area that emerges is actually the area that's more closely connected to the people, which is social movements. And I'll speak a little bit about the sort of power balances that emerge from a policy perspective from that, knowing that I have 1.5 minutes left. The challenges that we then see in this context is the state becomes increasingly wary of civil society actors, particularly because the cohort is made up of predominantly white males who have access to foreign funding, who are viewed as foreign agents. I don't know if folks recall a few years ago, that was the big state response to civil society engagement. Some philanthropists, particularly OSF or Open Societies Foundation, for folks who don't know, then begin the process following complaints from feminists within South Africa to transition to transform the makeup of civil society leadership to focus predominantly on Black women. However, Black women who assume these positions of leadership assume it in a context of lack of funding, so funding cuts emerge, and they're brought into basically a space of instability and crisis of legitimacy for civil society, where the formalized structures become the working Black, right? So the working Black activists who get a salary from a civil society organization versus the thinking white, and I'm trying not to be essentialist, I don't have time to unpack that, but I'd be happy to, who are in think tanks and able to make strategic recommendations to the state. Why does this matter for inequality? First of all, the work that is funded is the programmatic work, the logical frameworks, the 10,000 word grant proposals, the budgets, the data work. And the work that actually has been empirically proven to challenge inequality, social mobilization, is not funded. And it creates a serious disconnect between formalized civil society and social movements, and the latter is not well cohered and frameworked. Can I take this last one? Sure. Thank you. You also then see that in the context of delegitimacy of civil society organizations, when there are crises that are embedded in social and structural inequalities, like the CBD fires or the work of Ndifuna Kwazi in Cape Town around housing, that these are positioned as oppositional to the fundamental desires of South Africans who don't want foreign nationals occupying business properties in central locations. And you also see then the legitimization of the allied elites within this context who are political, who agree with those that say that civil society is fundamentally disruptive to the objectives of the state. On the other hand, protests are then labeled as traffic disruption. So folks will often hear in the news that there's a protest without the contextualization of why folks are protesting. And we know that protests are important because the state responds to protests. There's so much more to say. 7 minutes is not enough time. In this space that we currently find ourselves in, I will say that we're in a space of a vacuum. As formal civil society has been delegitimized, and there's an absence of formal public education programs that conscientize people, social media has risen as the space for public education. This is the space you learn politics, this is the space you find your people. However, the algorithms in social media are controlled by a technical elite who have been able to consolidate power that creates misogynistic or racist or xenophobic echo chambers that the masses then adopt. It's a problem. I can say more on some of the solutions a bit later.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you so much to all of the speakers. I think they just highlight really the crucial role of various sites of elite cohesion and legitimation. So corporate government advisory roles, philanthropy, urban development, in forging this kind of elite cohesion and ideological coherence, but also the importance of self-reflection among us as researchers, as UN staff, as civil society actors, in terms of how we frame the problem when we look at inequality, in terms of our own echo chambers and the sites where we gather, and our own possible elitism and exclusion. And finally, the key role in identifying and sharing possible fractures in elite cohesion and ideology, and in pointing out over and over again the flaws in ideas of Tina, the idea there is no alternative to neoliberalism as an economic policy, and also racial and caste dominance.
So 7 minutes is such a short time for you to answer these questions. So I'm going to ask a kind of a broad one now that hopefully you can all speak to, where I just want to ask, what do you see as the best route to reducing inequality and challenging current systems of elite power in India, South Africa, or more generally? Again, it's another big question, but hopefully you can revisit some of what you touched upon earlier.
Good question, Chairman. Question.
I'm abusing my privileges to make my final points. So there is a path forward, but it requires, I think, from a civil society perspective, to be a bit more innovative in how we consider organizing social movements. Some of the things that we're seeing in the field of tech and feminist responses to the rise of AI is that it's becoming increasingly difficult to organize. So folks are seeing more and more surveillance, more and more use of, particularly there's a Israeli software called Pegasus that can be embedded within emails that you don't even detect, that is monitoring and detecting people. A number of us working in the tech justice space are anticipating within the next 3 to 5 years a duplication of the model of social monitoring that we see in China, where people are given merits and demerits based on their compliance to social norms and political beliefs. And we really need to be smart around what is the future of mobilization if the empirical evidence points to its importance in addressing inequality. Some of the recommendations that a group of us are putting forward is alternatives to the common web. So how do we rise up a new cohort of activists and civil society actors who can organize on the dark web and who are adept in congruent in technology and tech. And then I think there's some real important work, outside of the policy framework around norms and political consciousness that hasn't featured as part of the conversation in a way that I think is really important. I think we've deferred a lot of our coherence around inequality and its historical context to the state or to social media platforms, relying on these to convey accurate information. And I know for my conscientization as a young Black South African in the different political youth leagues growing up, it was really important to find a space, to find my politics. And that for me is the biggest gap that we're facing at the moment, is we need to find ways to raise the language and the understanding of the drivers of inequality and the access routes. I think it was you, Maggie, who said the entry points into shifting that power. It's worked multiple times. It worked with the protests we saw in South Africa on gender equality a few years ago. It worked in some of the things we see in trade unions, being able to bring into focus like unemployment insurance. It's worked extensively when you see a critical mass of people with an aligned politics and aligned coherence on what it takes to address inequality, who can organize effectively without centering one leader, who can then easily be annihilated or targeted. Then you basically create a critical mass that can't be stopped. You see it with the Arab Spring. I have so many examples and research that points to this as some of the ways in which elite power, which is built on the concentration and alignment of a few, is directly challenged by the existence of a critical mass.
Shall we go in reverse order?
Yeah, and I think just to go connect from Masana's, what I want to say is that we have so many policies that work to reduce inequality and minimize the power of elites. We can talk about them a bit, but the issue of when we talk about political inequality is one of political will. So I think that just to emphasize that the role of civil society is extremely important. But to sort of focus a bit on the approach that we take at UNRIS, obviously understanding that inequality is built into the system. It's not a flaw, but it's a feature. So from our perspective, we think we sort of imagined what an alternative development paradigm would look like and what the pillars of that paradigm would be. And we have tried to sort of share that throughout the UN and hope that other actors can kind of embrace as well that idea. But for us, this new development paradigm that we've kind of worked towards, it involves implementing alternative economic approaches that center environmental and social justice, transformative social policy that's underpinned by fair fiscal contracts, and reformed multilateralism. So on the first point on shifting our economic systems, we focused on the importance of moving beyond growth paradigms, beyond the idea that the free market is going to bring about the kind of development that we need, and focus on shifting the relationships that exist between states, markets, communities, and nature. There are many strategies there. We talk a lot about the importance of just transitions and investing in social and solidarity economies. The second point on designing and implementing transformative social policies. I mean, there's so many I can go into, but the key ones in terms of public services, integrated care policies, and labor market policies. But a really important point there is that the fiscal contracts that underpins them is justly implemented, and that it redistributes the financing burden within and between countries, rather than the way it is distributed now. And then the final point around reforming multilateralism. As an institute within the UN, this is important for us to talk about. In terms of the actual functions of the UN, there are many changes that need to happen in terms of rules and regulations and binding agreements, but also in terms of the voices that different actors have and shifting the weight from northern actors to southern actors, and from private actors to civil society actors, which are extremely skewed at the moment, and also really decolonizing multilateralism, moving away from the understanding and the vision that we have now, which is that development challenges in the South are entirely results of governance and institutional failures, without acknowledging legacies of colonialism and exploitation that underpin that, a rejection of the idea that the northern models are the superior and are applicable across contexts, which is not the case. So I'll stop there, and maybe Katja has more to go on into some policy areas.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. I think actually that changing the economic paradigm is really a very important one. But of course, then the question comes back why we are sitting here. Then, we have talked at the beginning that actually, there is what we usually say, there is no shortage of knowledge and evidence-based policy recommendations that can address inequalities. But, what then a lot of people say, the political will is missing. But what we try to uncover, of course, over the last days is that this lack of political will is because of the influence of those actors that actually benefit from the status quo, and that benefit from liberal trade and access to patents and intellectual property rights, and that have the technology that we need to address climate change and sell it, that have the vaccines and the pharmaceutical drugs that they sell around the world, that have the logistical and insurance and all this control over global value chains, that resource-rich countries kind of need. And so, the global north companies actually that are based in countries without great natural resources actually even reap the profits from extractive industries and mining. So it's also skewed that we actually are struggling to implement these policies that can actually change inequalities and rein in elite power. And I think, I mean, what Masana already said, it's not to lose hope and despair now, because we have seen in the past that social mobilization, progressive governments, also even a different kind of type of capitalism that we had in the post-war area, which was more coordinated, which had much higher and more progressive tax systems, that it brought about, more welfare gains and was actually a social contract that many people, were more convinced of. I mean, the social contract was never completely inclusive, of course. It was always racialized. It was built on patriarchal structures, but it's also, understandable that we now say, oh, but even that social contract is broken now. There is almost no country in the world or more, no system where we could say, oh, they have a really well-working social contract, where everyone is more or less on an equal footing, and, governments are delivering, and corporations are paying their fair share. It's really not happening. It's all moving in the opposite direction. And I think this is where we can learn from the research on elite power and how we can maybe address them. And I very much like, your comment, Masana, we should not underestimate the power of the numbers, of course. I mean, we are talking about, the 0.1%, the 1%, these are very few people. Of course, the 1%, of global adults own more than 50% of global wealth. And the 50% poorest only have 1.1 of that wealth. But nevertheless, in democratic systems, each vote counts. The United Nations has also, the financial institutions not, but the rest of the United Nations has also one country, one vote. So numbers really matter. And what we maybe have to overcome is this extreme fragmentation and internal, fights and polarization and misinformation that, the majority of citizens are exposed to. It's been hard to organize civil society at the moment with the decline in trade unionism. Maybe not so bad in South Africa, but, really in decline in many other places. And with this individualization, which also got such a big push through COVID, of course. Young people, they have learned, to be on their own. They feel much more isolated. They build their social relations through technology. So there are a lot of changes in our societies, which makes it harder to organize. But I think there is still some optimism that we can create alliances, that actually are able to promote and implement these equality enhancing policies, because they are proven, they are out there. We have the evidence that they work, and also they won't make elites much poorer. I mean, to be honest, the threat towards the rich and wealthy is not, as you say, the white panic or whatever it is. It's actually not that serious. I think, we have examples that we had periods where, we had really a much better shared prosperity, even without having, authoritarian regimes or, a planned economy. It was still a free market economy, but there was a social contract that made sure, that costs and benefits were much better shared.
Thank you. And so we've got 30 minutes left. So maybe if I could ask for some brief comments from the two remaining panelists, and then we'll go to questions and yeah.
Okay, sure. I usually don't have to wear this hat because as sociologists, we just diagnose the problem and we sit, and especially if you're researching elites, then where do you look for solutions? Because it's not going to emerge from within them, right? That's not where the change lies, and we're very clear about it. I want to echo what Hasana has said in terms of raising political consciousness, because in India, at the current juncture that we are, the fight is lost partially, almost completely in the parliament and in the legal system. So constitution, when you say constitutionalism, I'm almost envious of that I hear what you're saying, but it's slipping for us. So the change really lies with what Dr. Ambedkar, who's a leading intellectual and the father of the Indian Constitution, has said and written in numerous places, which is to organize, educate, and agitate. And I've spent the last 5 months in India, and I've returned much more politically hopeful this time because I see the churnings on the ground. And this is a long, protracted struggle. This is not going to happen overnight. We're dealing with a Hindu right-wing government, which came to power on the basis of a 100-year-old institution, right? So you're speaking at the level of social relations here, which need to mend. At the moment that they're particularly torn and fractured and hurtful, right? So I'll stop with it.
Okay, thank you. So one concise comment, and then we'll move to questions.
I've got
Thank you.
2 points though. Sorry, but yeah, I want to start with because this issue of we need a new economic paradigm has come up over and over, and I think I want to relate that to neoclassical economics, neoclassical macroeconomics particularly, because all the time we hear in South Africa, for instance, is that we've got the policies, we just have to implement them. We've had these policies for a long time. And I point out to people that we've had the wrong kind of macroeconomic policies for the longest time, and it hasn't changed. The other point that people make is that government keeps changing its policy approach. We've had the New Growth Part and the NDPs and these other plans, but they've all been based on gear and a neoliberal macroeconomic policy framework that is based on basically unrealistic economics. Economics that's not, basically uses, from a philosophical, epistemological point of view, an instrumentalist logic, not a reality-based logic. It's in terms of time, it's based on logical time. Think about equilibria and moving from one equilibrium to another, rather than real time, which means you can't take into account expectations and uncertainty. Or you do it in a very specific way. And this may sound sort of very abstract, but it has very real outcomes. It means that you don't see the path dependency. You don't see the role of racial prejudice, gender prejudice. You don't see those things and the impact it's had cumulatively and continues to have cumulatively, but also then the role of institutions aren't taken into account within that. And the fact that we have these institutions, so we end up having people doing budgets, thinking about debt, shaping, and also having independence from government. There's a push now for a fiscal rule. We have a central bank that's independent, that has imposed monetary austerity like this, Fed and other people on society. In a country with huge unemployment, poverty, and inequality, we basically said, but these aren't the choices. And when you oppose that, you get accused of what, for instance, Thabo Mbeki called this infantile syndrome or infantile disorder, drawing from Lenin's critique of the German left, right? You're seen as sort of not serious. This child, you're not the adult in the room. You can't actually participate because you don't talk to this scientific neoclassical macroeconomic theory that underpins the bullshit that they're pushing on us, right? So yeah, before I get too upset, I should say that the second point I would make was we now live in a world where all developing countries, particularly across Africa and us, have much higher levels of debt, not from our own fault, right? Number one has been the imposition of austerity and fiscal consolidation, which is proven to have caused limited growth, which means that GDP has been constrained, and the fact that debt to GDP is a ratio, right? The top part has been increasing relative to the bottom part, so debt to GDP levels have increased. And that is seen as a problem, and we're not seen as credible because of that, and we need to now cut spending, which means not sort of looking at can we be more efficient or so, but basically the kind of thing that Musk is doing in the US, we've been doing since the 80s through structural adjustment. It's basically taking a hatchet and cutting social spending, education, health, right? And in South Africa, the National Treasury will say, well, we're spending 60% of our budget on the social wage, but we haven't actually spent adequately on rebuilding the state to serve all South Africans since 1990 and the transition to apartheid. So when thinking about debt, we also need a huge change in that paradigm. I think the UN's done really good work, and the General Secretary of the UN has come out appealing to the G7 and other countries to say, change the way in which you approach debt. But I think within South Africa, we need to actually look at what happened under quantitative easing and the ways in which the developed countries acted and managed interest rates and other things at the time when facing a crisis. And then this kind of telling developing countries the way you deal with this is by cutting government spending, fiscal consolidation, and the kind of things that's causing us problems and causing us inadequate social spending. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So, thanks to the speakers. And now we're coming to the audience. We have 22 minutes left. So, if people have questions, perhaps I'll gather a queue. Please raise your hand, and if you could introduce yourself before asking your question and keep it concise, if possible. Thank you.
Okay, myself, Dr. Suraj Beri. I teach sociology at Nagaland University in India. My question to all the panelists, and it's a very interesting discussion on this very important theme, which is very close to my heart and also my research area, inequalities and elites. And often we study and talk about how elite domination is reproduced. Very less kind of public discussion is on how elite domination reproduction is kind of restrained or kind of controlled or challenged, in what ways. And more often than not, the response has been that you create certain kind of policy discourse where you create a system where the power of elite is not in terms of massive, in terms of budgeting, in terms of the rule over the political system. But the problem is that elite is the one which is implementing these policies. So when you talk about uniform education or health system, elites will be implementing them and they see no benefit in doing it because it is not going to their own families. So in what ways do we then talk about elite domination, the challenging of elite domination, other than, of course, the social movements? What are the other options available within the parliamentary and constitutional discourse to kind of restrain their kind of power? We have Thomas Piketty coming in and telling us that in last 100 years after World War, there is a decline in the concentration of wealth at certain levels after these new states were formed, after the colonial struggle. But now the elites are taking it back. They are saying that you had your fun, now we are taking it back through financialization and neoliberalism. So where do we see this? How do we kind of conceptualize about it? And beyond the academy.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, someone in the back. Thank you. And please introduce yourself.
Hello, sorry.
Please introduce yourself.
Mohammed Lokan, private individual. I'd just like to ask a question, and I'm not an academic, so it may be naive. What exactly is an elite and how do we conceptualize it? Because I think there's a difference in how the UN colleagues conceptualize it as it's an us versus them. Whereas if you look in the South African context, and I think UCT and SALTU have done some work on this, if you earn like above a small amount, you're in the top 10%. So that makes us sitting here in this room out of the 1% or 0.1% or whatever it is. And income and economic power is really tied to political power as well. So doesn't this make this forum itself an echo chamber, if I could be a bit provocative? And what is our basis of analysis thereof? And are we willing to forego some of that benefits like cheap Uber Eats or the ability to drive anywhere in furtherance of reducing inequalities? To Petra, I really enjoyed your contribution. Thank you very much. Just two quick questions for that. Could you please expand on the self-sacrificing aspects of the moral character, the moral action of Indian elites? And I think about it in terms of the South African context, where with the whole discourse about should I stay or should I go, should we immigrate? Whereas life here, if you are in the top 5%, is absolutely heaven on earth if we compare it elsewhere. And what do you think about Waterfall City being owned by the Public Investment Company? Thanks.
Excellent questions again. Thank you. And so we have maybe we'll take a couple more questions here and then we'll go to the panelists and then move on.
My name is Spiros. I'm from Stellenbosch University. And I'd like to pick up on my colleague and say, I think we need to be more strenuous in our own kind of arguments from a public policy perspective. You know, when we speak about political will, I mean, it's almost tautological. You're always going to have more political will to overcome the lack of political will. I mean, it's a total, and you can only judge political will after the fact. I mean, and that's the issue. So, I mean, you need to be a bit more disciplined in your thinking. The second thing is that, you know, I mean, Oxfam has written a major critique of evidence-based planning. I mean, it says you can have evidence-informed planning, partly because of organizational sociologies of the very state organization that you're talking about, you know, what bureaucrats do within the state. So, I mean, I'm a bit concerned about that. But the last point I just want to make is that, I mean, history suggests that when the elite acts against or acts to alleviate poverty or to increase employment, there's kind of three historical conditions that come together normally. I mean, this has been, first of all, the elites see their fate as interdependent with the poor. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the elites believe that the poor have certain powers at their disposal, like crime, disease, and so forth. And the third thing is that the elites think that they need to do some kind of action right now, otherwise it's going to explode. Now, in this situation that we're sitting in right now, none of those conditions exist. Now, so the issue is then how do you sew the public policy needle through it if you misguide it in your own terms? Yeah.
And another question.
Thank you so much. My name is Avela, and I'm an associate researcher at SCIS. So I had a question for Masana. So I just wanted to ask, maybe just to be the devil's advocate, that knowing the landscape of philanthropy in South Africa, how do we ensure when we are thinking about mass mobilization, how do we think about the allies that we choose? And how do you ensure autonomy for, this mass movement and this conscientization? And how do you ensure that doesn't get co-opted? Because I'm just thinking, about, we voted last year, right? And there were quite a few political parties that emerged. And obviously, knowing that political parties are also funded by elites. And there is the level of influence that they have in terms of the kind of agenda that gets pushed. So then how do you, when we think about mass mobilization to counter elites, how do we ensure that our agenda becomes autonomous? Thank you.
Thank you for those wonderful questions. And I'm going to pass you this microphone to use. And should we just do the opposite order again? We'll go back and forth. So actually, that's
Actually, I don't think there were any questions to you guys.
yeah.
To everybody. You guys can jump on.
Okay, thanks. Shall I address the questions that you asked me? I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Mohammed, okay. Let me start with the Waterfall City question and the public investment company. That's an astute observation, absolutely. I think I find the South African state fascinating. And I think there's so much work that can be done here. The work that echoes most closely to the way I see the South African state is done by Sarita Pillai. She comes from a geography and architecture background. She's at WITS as well. And she says the South African state, and she's looked at real estate closely, she says it's a polymorphic state. And that's the term that she builds through her thesis. So I'd urge you to perhaps look at that. So essentially, if I can give you the argument without sort of, reducing it too much, is that she's saying that there could be a governance wing, there is a finance wing, and then there's, of course, a citizenship discourse. There are different ways of approaching the South African state, and these two can very well exist in contradiction, right? So she builds on that further, right? So that's the response to the waterfall question. Around the self-sacrificing and should I go and should I not go, it looks like it's another axis of victimhood, just that it sounds different in this land and in mine. Mine comes from because it is a business caste that has historically engaged in professions like money lending. There is a stigma associated from being a business caste. So when they claim that they're self-sacrificial, what they're saying is that we pay the taxes, we give you the schools, and then you behave like this and you think we are no good, right? But that discourse is also changing. I was in the field 5 years ago. So right now, there is a lot of aspiration around wealth. The Ambani wedding just happened, and that's quite reflective of the way it's traveled in social media. And since I was in Mumbai, the fashion sense has changed as well. From the wedding, you can see a whole counterfeit market production line has also evolved, which mirrors what people were wearing at the wedding, which tells you that the aspiration around wealth is shifting in India away from this kind of stigmatized, narrative. Echo chamber, yeah, well taken, absolutely. Academia as a well chamber, as an echo chamber, absolutely. I think the further the ivory tower is from the ground, the worse it is, and the less people should listen to what's being said. The one way to do it is to integrate, right? That would be ideally the way to do it. Shall I stop? How to conceptualize elites? Somebody else wants to do it? Shall I quickly do it? Okay. How to conceptualize elites? So there are different ways of doing it. You can do the positional approach. You can do the reputational approach. Positional approach, you can go and look at the top CEOs and the boards. That's one way of doing it. Reputation is by what is the weight that they carry, the cloud that they carry around them. So these are two ways in which elites have been identified. The way in which they've been defined is that control over disproportionate resources which are social, political, and cultural. So you're not just saying ownership, but you're saying from that ownership, you're also wielding some power. That's how you identify an elite actor. Thanks.
I can just maybe respond a bit to Mohammed's question. I can't speak to the South African context, but just something that that comes to mind in my own context is thinking about the way that the discourse of the rich in the US, for example, is that they want to sort of the discourse aims to sort of influence the general public, let's say people like you, people in this, the kind of people in this room, to identify more closely with them than with people below them on the poverty scale. But when you actually look at the numbers, the distance between us and the top elites and us and people at the lower end of the poverty spectrum is massively different. So there's a category above that is in its own extreme category numerically, and then which is sort of on nowhere near the same kind of scale in terms of our proximity to each other below that sort of top threshold. And that sort of trick is, I think, contributes a lot to the kinds of right-wing extremism that we see, the shifts happening in political discourses, where people, when they identify more with the policy, with the interests of, then they feel that the interests of the rich are aligned with their own. That's influencing the way they're voting and the choices that they make, and it ultimately has huge consequences. But at the same time, the difference though is, and I think what's really important about your point is that people at the sort of middle income level, or this kind of top 10% that you mentioned, have much greater ability to insulate themselves from the negative effects of the kind of breakdown of the social contract that we see when elites take this level of power and influence. So it does put us in a different situation that I think is really worth noting. We don't have the same level of wealth to influence ourselves in the way that the very wealthy do, like building these kind of bunkers to protect from climate catastrophe. But we can move into more private spaces that kind of protect us in that way, where we don't have to rely in the same way on public resources that are becoming less and less sufficient. Yeah, I'll let the others continue with the other questions.
Okay, reminder we have 8 minutes left, and we would like to take some questions from online. So if you have a burning point to make, if you can make it quickly, and then we'll collect some questions online.
Okay, that puts me under pressure. No, I just wanted to quickly respond to Sujat's question, like, if and actually to say political will, it's not a term I really appreciate, because I think we don't need political will. If we're in a democratic system, we vote the leaders in the party that has a program, that we want to support. And then, if these guys are selected and elected, they have to implement it, and there is no need for a political will. They have the obligation to do their part on delivering on the electoral program that they have promised to people. However, I think, we need some sort of reform of democracy, because what we see now is that illiberal, political leaders, let's say, we have illiberal democracy. So political leaders that are anti-democratic are voted into power, and then they dismantle institutions, don't respect the rule of law, and so on and so forth. And there is no penalization of it. The judicial system kind of is struggling. The parliament is struggling. It seems it's really difficult. So I think that there needs to be some sort of rethinking our democracies. But how we can, and then this leads me to what you say. How can we then actually influence elites, that they're not influencing, exercising undue political influence, or preventing basically necessary reforms to happen. And this can only happen if we have actually a rule of law, strong institutions, and politicians that are committed to the public sector and the public good, and just don't let this particular interests gain this political clout. I mean, it is really a symptom of a failure of our political systems that individuals and rich corporations can have this influence. So we can, of course, have moral arguments and try to bring them back into the social contract, but I think we really have to not allow this behavior to happen. It's not legal, it's anti-democratic, so it should be penalized. And this is a little bit, and then we need civil society and media to make this public, to name and shame these actions, and really hold the governments to account. I think this is, how we should deal, I guess, with elites that, are over-exercising power. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'm going to read out a couple of questions online. I think the third question, hopefully, they feel has been partially addressed, but just as we only have 5 minutes left. So one question, just to kind of pull out a couple of parts of it, we might have time to answer. Regarding the description afforded to the current Indian government as Hindu fascist, how do we compare this with previous administrations in India? And which period when would that not apply, essentially? And how does it contrast with colonial rule? And then I think we'll leave it there in that question. And then I'll move down, if I can. Yes. So the second question I'll call out is, so this is someone who's writing from Ecuador, and they say that here the predatory elites, excuse me, sorry, this is scrolling wildly. Here the predatory economic elites have occupied positions of power in the political field, and one of the mechanisms to hide the effect of their practices is to prevent estimates of inequality indicators. So in the survey used to measure the Gini index, they removed the people with the highest incomes to reduce it. And so their question is, have you found other mechanisms by which elites try to hide the effects of their predatory policies? And I think we'll end there from the online questions and pass back to the panel.
I've got the mic, so maybe I can start. I mean, on the question from the person from Ecuador, in South Africa, we've seen huge levels of legal and illegal capital flow. And within that, and also within the large corporations, base erosion and profit shifting, that's the broader term used. And so we sort of have a sense that there's a huge inequality, and we estimate, and Arup could probably talk a bit about this, about the levels of wealth and wealth inequality, right? But we actually don't know a proper estimate, and a lot of these mechanisms are used, offshore accounts, and say, and in different countries, including in developed countries like London and the state of some states in the US as well, spaces where people can safely move wealth and illegally or legally transfer wealth without either being measured and taken into account in GDP. So that's, I just wanted to maybe, sorry, I know we're limited in time and other people probably have a lot to add as well. But with the solutions, and I mean, I see, and I think it's linked to this point about illicit capital flight and our government chooses to manage it and regulate it. But there's this sense with economics that government is capable of creating independent institutions like the central banks, and that populism and government's decisions and government's representations, government can be captured, but it's within a neoclassical macroeconomics that actually reduces the role of the state and doesn't see the role of the state as different from an individual agent without its own thinking. And that kind of economics is very different to the kind of economics that you had in the post-Second World War period associated with welfare states and more development. And we're not making a case for going back to that, but I think it's about changing the way we think about economics and the fact that this then becomes almost a foundation on which elites can build, a room for inequality and keep things out of democratic processes and say, no, but governments shouldn't be allowed to do that. Governments can be captured in those things, but not actually seeing that the state can be a positive force for progressive change within the society. So I want to stop there. Was it this way?
Yeah, sounds good.
I'll take us home. So I think, is it Mohammed at the back? Just something that I would like to problematize is the assumption that all of us here are elites and essentially disconnected from the proletariat, I should just say, working class. I think that's a function of economic hegemony. And in a study I did on the Black middle class in South Africa across race, class, and gender, I found that the ties between the Black middle class and the working class are much stronger and permeable than economics allows for. And so I think we also need to add complexity to how we conceptualize the individual within this context. And I don't think that we all have the same privilege. We are privileged. I have an accent, I know for sure. But I think that interrogating power is important when we're looking at spaces of allyship, which brings me to Avela's, is it Avela, right? Avela's really important question. So my favorite anecdote of philanthropy working is Darren Walker, previous president of Ford, described before Martin Luther King went up to give his speech. They were his program officer was chasing him around to ask him to sign a grant agreement so he could access emergency funding. And, I think that that's an individual, that's a progressive, maybe not as radical as Malcolm X, but a progressive stance in that history in America. And I think that's what we're missing. We see funding and philanthropic interest going with the ideas and the interests of individuals who believe themselves to be moral actors, but are just funding things that are interesting to them. Oh, this looks fun. I want to make an impact here. And I think that's part of the problem. And so when we start to think about recontrolling that power, gaining control over our decision making, I think it's really important for civil society actors, particularly in the context of Africa, to remember, first of all, that the outflows of mineral extraction, I think I don't remember the exact number, but it's maybe 100 times more than the input in the form of aid. And so even the aid we're receiving, if we worked within the context of a government that was responsive and taxing extraction or whatever in an appropriate way, we would have a better outcome. And I think as well, part of our issue is that we facilitated an approach where corporate mechanisms can co-opt things like DEI, and we use that to then receive their funding for important work around GBV without interrogating the source of that funding. And so as we move to a community-based model of local organizing, which has been proven to work, I wish I could send you all of the research, what you then have is the distribution of resources at a local level that we can then easily solve for coordination at the global level. And our issue is that the elite, the technological elite, has become so efficient at creating fractures in society that they can then weaponize in times of elections that result in the situation we're in.
Thank you. So we are over time, I'm sorry to say, but it just leaves me to say a huge thank you to the panelists, a huge thank you to everyone who supported running this event successfully, and a huge thank you to the audience.